The morning I found out, I was standing in my own kitchen, wearing the same flannel robe I'd had since 2009, drinking coffee that had gone cold, while I stared at a document I wasn't supposed to have seen. My hands weren't shaking. That surprised me more than anything else. I want to tell you this story the way it actually happened, not the way I wish it had. Not the version I told my doctor when my blood pressure spiked in February, and not the cleaned-up version I gave my attorney, the real one. Because I think some of you already know this feeling. The specific kind of cold that settles in your chest when you realize the betrayal didn't come from a stranger. It never does. My name is Richard. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years building a small civil engineering firm in Central Ohio. Nothing glamorous. Just bridge inspections, municipal contracts, the kind of slow and steady work that doesn't make headlines but keeps roads from collapsing. I sold a 60% stake to a regional infrastructure group in 2019 and retained the rest. Enough to be comfortable. Enough, apparently, to be worth stealing from. My wife, I'll call her my wife, because that's what she was, legally. For 4 years, was 41 when I met her. I was 59. I know what you're thinking. I thought it too, in the back of my mind. The way you think about weather when you're planning an outdoor wedding. You note the clouds. You decide not to cancel. Her name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that she was smart and patient, and that she understood exactly how to make a man my age feel like he was still worth something. I don't say that to be bitter. I say it because it's operationally accurate. She was running a plan, and I was the terrain she was surveying. My son was 28 when she and I got married. He stood at the back of the venue with his hands in his pockets and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I noticed. I told myself it was adjustment. Young men don't always know how to feel about their fathers remarrying. I gave him room. I gave her the benefit of the doubt. I gave everybody everything they needed except, apparently, my full attention. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It never is. It was a dinner. 8 months into the marriage, when my nephew, my late brother's son, 26, a kid I'd helped put through 2 years of community college, showed up unannounced on a Tuesday night. He and my wife had met twice at family gatherings. I didn't think anything of it when he knocked. I offered him a beer and leftover lasagna, and we sat around the kitchen table and talked about nothing for an hour. After he left, my wife mentioned that he'd texted her to ask if I was home. She said it casually, the way you mention the mail or the weather. I nodded. I filed it somewhere in the back of my mind, where I kept things I didn't want to examine too closely. What I should have done was open that file immediately. What I did instead was pour myself another drink and watch the rest of a basketball game and tell myself I was a grown man who trusted his wife. The second sign came 3 months later when I found a forwarded email thread on our shared printer. My wife had forgotten to clear the queue. 8. Don Moore. And Amon May. The data. Don May. 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 It was a message between her and my nephew, and what it described was not two people who had only met twice. They had been in contact for over a year. Before our wedding, I stood at the printer for a long time. The paper was warm in my hand. Outside, it was raining, and I could hear my wife upstairs on a phone call, laughing at something. A normal laugh, an unbothered laugh, the laugh of someone who had no idea the floor had just shifted under her feet. I put the paper back in the tray. I went to the garage. I sat in my truck for 45 minutes. Here's the thing about being 63 that nobody tells you when you're younger. You've already survived enough loss that a new one doesn't knock you flat the way it used to. My first wife, my son's mother, died of an aggressive cancer 11 years ago. I watched her go from diagnosis to gone in 7 months. After that, grief became something I understood anatomically. I knew where it sat in the body, how long it lasted, what it asked of you. What I was feeling in my truck in the rain was grief's cousin. something colder and more deliberate. I did not cry. I planned. The first call I made the next morning was to my attorney. Not to file anything, just to understand my position. The second call was to a financial forensics firm my attorney recommended. I told no one else. Not my sister. Not my neighbor who'd been my friend for 20 years. No one. But the third call, the one I almost didn't make, was to my son. He answered on the second ring, which he never does. I told him I needed to see him in person. I didn't say why. He said he'd be there in 2 hours, and there was something in his voice, a specific quality of stillness, that made me stop for a second before I hung up. He arrived with coffee from the place down the street from his apartment. He knew my order. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where my nephew had eaten lasagna, and smiled at my wife. And he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him since his mother's funeral. Careful. Waiting. How long have you known? I asked him. He didn't ask what I meant. He set his coffee down. He laced his fingers together on the table the way he used to when he was small and had done something wrong and was trying to figure out how much trouble he was actually in. 7 months, he said. Maybe 8. I want to tell you I handled that well. I want to tell you I was rational and composed and said exactly the right thing. What I actually did was stand up, walk to the sink, and stare out the window at the backyard for about 3 minutes without speaking. He didn't fill the silence. He waited me out. In that way, he is exactly like his mother. When I turned back around, he told me everything. He had noticed it first at our 1-year anniversary dinner, a look between my wife and my nephew, a fraction of a second. The kind of thing you catch and then convince yourself you imagined. But he was 28 and sharper than I gave him credit for, and he didn't convince himself. He started paying attention. Over the following months, he pieced it together the way you do when you don't have hard evidence, but you have instinct and time. He saw them leave a family barbecue within 10 minutes of each other. He noticed my nephew suddenly developing opinions about real estate and asset structures, topics he'd never shown any interest in before. He found a thread on my nephew's laptop once, when he was helping him troubleshoot a Wi-Fi issue. And though he didn't read the whole thing, he saw enough. What my wife and my nephew were building was a case for a conservatorship. Their theory was that I had been showing signs of cognitive decline, memory issues, confusion, erratic financial decisions. They had, apparently, been documenting things, selectively, strategically, in the way that people do when they've decided the story before they start writing it. A misremembered appointment here, a confused conversation there. Small things that, assembled into a file and presented to the right judge, could paint a picture of a man no longer capable of managing his own affairs. If the conservatorship was granted, my wife, as my spouse, would have had significant influence over my finances, my remaining stake in the firm, the property, the retirement accounts. My nephew, presumably, would have been compensated for his assistance. I sat back down at the kitchen table. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up at me. Because I didn't have enough, he said. And because I knew you. I knew if I came to you with half a case, you'd give her a chance to explain it. And she'd explain it. And I'd lose my only advantage. He wasn't wrong. I knew he wasn't wrong. I had spent 4 years being the kind of man who gave people the benefit of the doubt, because I had earned enough in this life to afford generosity. It had not occurred to me, not really, not in the practical sense, that someone would use that generosity as a gap to walk through. I was building something, he said. I needed more time, so we made a decision. Sitting at that table, not a dramatic decision, a quiet one. We decided to let them keep building their case while we built ours. What followed was, I'll be honest with you, one of the stranger experiences of my life. I had to perform, lightly, carefully, just enough to keep them comfortable. If they were watching for signs of confusion, I gave them occasional ambiguity. A twice-told story. At dinner, a moment of apparent blankness when my nephew asked me about a property line dispute from 2019. Nothing egregious. Nothing that would hold up in a real clinical evaluation. Just enough fog to keep them from suspecting the lights were on and I was watching from the other side of the window. My son became my logistics. He coordinated with the financial forensics team. He helped me quietly reposition certain assets through means that were entirely legal and that I had been meaning to do for years anyway. He drove me to appointments that he listed in his phone under names my wife wouldn't recognize if she happened to see them. We didn't talk about it often. We didn't need to. We had developed a shorthand the way people do when they share a serious purpose and don't want to spend energy narrating it to each other. There was one evening in November, I remember it was cold. The specific Ohio cold that comes before the first snow, where the air has a metallic quality, when we were sitting on my back porch after dinner, and he looked out at the yard and said, "I keep thinking about Mom." I didn't ask him to elaborate. I already knew. His mother would have had none of this. She would have walked into a room and named every dynamic in it inside of 90 seconds and then calmly dismantled whatever needed dismantling. She was precise in the way that people are when they have survived difficult things and no longer have patience for theater. "She would have liked that you figured it out," I told him. He made a sound that was close to a laugh. "She would have been furious at me for not coming to you sooner." "Probably both," I said. We sat out there until it was too cold to stay. The document they prepared was thorough. I'll give them that. My wife's attorney, and she had an attorney, which told me the plan had moved further along than even my son had known, had assembled approximately 40 pages of notes, timestamps, secondhand accounts, and what appeared to be a psychological evaluation from a professional I had never met or authorized, which my own attorney later described as one of the more audacious procedural maneuvers she'd seen in 30 years of practice. The filing was set for the third week of January. On January 9th, I had a sit-down with my financial forensics team and both of my attorneys. We went through everything. The conservatorship filing was serious, but it was built on a foundation of manufactured evidence, which is a different thing from no foundation. The difference mattered, and it would matter in court. But the process would be long and expensive, and more importantly, public. I did not want this to go public. Not for my sake. I stopped caring about my reputation in the particular way you stop caring about things after you've buried a spouse. I didn't want it public because I had a business with municipal clients and long-term contracts and employees who had mortgages, and a drawn-out legal spectacle involving accusations about my mental competence was the kind of thing that made procurement officers nervous. So instead, we gave them a window. On January 14th, I left a folder on my home office desk. I did not hide it. I did not draw attention to it. I simply left it there, in a position that suggested I might have been reviewing it, and stepped away. The folder contained documents. Specifically, it contained a draft of my revised estate structure and the asset repositioning we had completed in December, along with what appeared to be a letter of intent to sell my remaining stake in the firm. My wife found it that evening. I know because I came home to a different quality of silence, the kind of silence that is not the absence of sound but the presence of something being held very still. She made dinner. We ate. She was pleasant and warm and asked about my day, and I told her a few mild lies about meetings I hadn't had, and she received them without blinking and then poured herself a second glass of wine. I went to bed early. The next morning, my nephew called. He asked if he could come by. He had an idea about the firm, had been doing some reading, thought there might be a strategic angle worth discussing. His voice had a brightness to it that he couldn't entirely suppress, the specific energy of someone who believes they are 3 moves from checkmate. I told him to come by Thursday. He arrived at 6:30. My wife made coffee. The 3 of us sat in the living room, and my nephew talked for 20 minutes about an idea that made no structural sense, but was designed to get me to sign something. A document that he slid across the coffee table toward the end of the conversation with the casualness of someone who has rehearsed the casualness. I picked it up. I read it. I set it back down. "What exactly is this transferring?" I asked. He explained it. The explanation was fluent and carefully prepared, and underneath the preparation was a fundamental misunderstanding of who he was talking to. I had spent 31 years reading contracts and assessing structural integrity. I could look at something and identify usually within a few seconds, where the load was being applied and whether the underlying structure could hold it. This structure could not hold it. I need to think about it, I said. He nodded. My wife nodded. They were very good at not looking at each other. But there was a slight synchrony in the nods, just a half-second delay, like a translation from one language to another that confirmed what I already knew. Thursday night, after my nephew left, I went upstairs, and my wife said something to me from the doorway of the bathroom, something casual and domestic, a question about the weekend, and I looked at her for a moment before answering. Really looked. I thought about the first time I had met her, at a fundraiser for the County Historical Society, and how she had laughed at something I said and touched my arm afterward, and I had felt, for the first time in several years, like a man who was still visible. I had been visible. All right. I don't think we're going to work out, I said. She went very still. I think you should call your attorney in the morning, I said. The next morning, I called mine first. What happened over the following 6 weeks I will compress for you, not because the details aren't interesting, but because the details are largely bureaucratic, and also partly under a non-disclosure agreement that my attorney would prefer I not narrate in granular terms. What I can tell you is this. The conservatorship filing was withdrawn before it was ever formally submitted. The documents my nephew had drafted were reviewed by counsel and declined. The marriage was dissolved in March, faster than most dissolutions, because neither party wanted to prolong the exposure, and because my wife's attorney, upon reviewing the complete picture of what we had documented and what they had attempted, advised her client to settle quietly and move on. My nephew has not called me since December. I don't expect he will. My wife got what the agreement specified. It was not what she had been planning to get. There's a difference. On the last day of March, I drove up to my son's apartment. He lived on the 3rd floor of a building near a park with an old oak tree in the center of it, and we walked around that park for a while, not saying much, the way you do when something large has been resolved and you're both still getting used to the silence where it used to be. You handled it well, he said. At some point, we handled it, I said. He looked ahead at the path. I keep trying to figure out when I should have come to you, he said. Like if there was a better time. A smarter time. I thought about that. You came to me when you had enough, I said. That was the right time. He was quiet for a while. The wind moved through the oak tree. An older couple walked past us in the up direction, holding hands without particularly thinking about it. The way people do when the habit has become longer than the intention. Are you okay? He asked. I've thought about that question a lot. In the months since, I've been asked variations of it by my sister, my doctor, my attorney, a couple of old colleagues, and the guy who has been cutting my hair since 1998. Everyone wants to know if I'm okay, and I understand why. Because the story, when summarized, sounds like a thing that should break a person. Older man. Younger wife. Deliberate. Long-term deception. The machinery of the legal system being prepared and aimed. Here is what I've concluded. I am okay because I was never, actually, in the position they thought they had put me in. They saw a man in a flannel robe with cold coffee and a company he'd sold most of and a grief he'd been carrying for 11 years, and they decided that was a man who could be managed. They were solving for the wrong variable. The robe and the coffee and the grief were real. What they had miscalculated was what the grief had made me into. When you have already lost the thing you most feared losing, very little frightens you after that. My son and I had dinner at a barbecue place he liked, and we talked about things that had nothing to do with any of this. A book he was reading, a road trip he was thinking about, a conversation he'd had with someone at work that made him think about changing directions. Regular life. The kind that keeps happening, stubbornly and without drama, regardless of what else is going on. Driving home, I took the long way because I wasn't in any hurry. The roads were dry. The evening light had that particular quality it gets in early spring, longer than you expect, golden without being warm, like the day is still thinking about whether to leave. I turned on the radio, some song I half recognized from a long time ago. I drove. I want to be clear about one thing, because I think it matters. I don't tell this story because I want sympathy. I don't need anyone to feel sorry for me. I am a 63-year-old man with a paid-off house and a son I am proud of and a career that meant something. I tell it because I know there are people listening who have that same piece of paper in their hand right now, still warm from the printer, and they are standing in their own kitchen, trying to figure out what to do with what they just learned. Here is what I can tell you from the other side of it. Don't react. Plan. Don't. Plan. Find the person you trust most in the world and have a real conversation. Give yourself time to be angry in private so you can be strategic in public. And understand that the person who underestimated you has already made the decisive mistake. Everything after that is patience. The morning I found out, my hands weren't shaking. That surprised me. But it shouldn't have. I had been through worse. I had built things from harder materials. And whatever they thought they saw when they looked at me across that dinner table, whatever profile they had assembled, whatever version of Richard they believed they were dealing with, they had not accounted for the one thing that has always been true. I built bridges for 31 years. I know exactly how much weight a structure can hold.